July 25th, 1944. 3 miles south of Saint-Lô, Normandy. Morning fog clings to the hedgerows, thick as wet cloth, against SS Obersturmbannführer Hans von Luck's face, as he scans the bocage from his Panzer's turret. Around him, 60 tons of German steel idles in concealed positions. Panthers, Tigers, Marktherfes, the armored fist that has crushed Polish cavalry, shattered French columns, and held against Soviet masses. His crew is silent, confident. The Americans are coming, yes. But the doctrine is clear. Armored warfare is won on the ground, tank against tank, where German superiority matters. The bocage terrain favors defense. His panzers are hull down, camouflaged, supported by 88mm guns that can kill any Allied tank at range. Air attacks, harassment. Dangerous perhaps, but never decisive. Then it happens. Through the smoke and dust of the morning bombardment comes a sound unlike anything in 3 years of war. Not the high-altitude drone of heavy bombers, but something lower, angrier. A roar that builds and builds until the air itself seems to scream. P-47 Thunderbolts, dozens of them, screaming down from 8,000 feet in near vertical dives. They don't strafe and leave. They circle, they hunt. Rockets tear into engine decks with surgical precision. 500-pound bombs land within meters of his hull-down position. The 50-caliber machine guns, 8 per aircraft, find every vision slit, every open hatch, every exposed crew member. Within 20 minutes, von Luck watches 4 Panthers explode into flame. Not from enemy tanks, not from anti-tank guns, from the sky. What impossible doctrine had the Americans unleashed? The certainty that SS Obersturmbannführer Hans von Luck carried into that Normandy morning was not arrogance. It was doctrine, forged in the crucible of 5 years of continental warfare, and tempered by victories that stretched from the forests of Poland to the steppes of Russia. As dawn broke over the hedgerows on July 24th, 1944, 3 miles south of Saint-Lô, von Luck sat in the turret of his Panther tank, part of the 2nd Panzer Division, and surveyed a landscape that seemed to exist solely to favor his kind of war. The bocage country of Normandy was a defender's paradise, ancient earthen walls topped with impenetrable hedges, creating a labyrinth of natural fortifications where a single, well-positioned tank could hold a crossroads against an entire company. Around him, 60 tons of German steel sat in carefully concealed positions. Panthers, with their sloped armor and high-velocity 75mm guns. Tigers mounting the legendary 80mm cannon that could punch through any Allied tank at ranges that made return fire impossible. Mark IV workhorses that had carried the Wehrmacht across Europe. This was the armored fist that had crushed Polish cavalry in days, shattered French columns in weeks, and held against Soviet masses that outnumbered them 10-1. Von Luck had seen it all, the desperate fighting at Arras where German panzers nearly broke the British Expeditionary Force, the sweeping advances through the Ukraine, the grinding defensive battles at Kursk, where tactical excellence had nearly overcome catastrophic numerical disadvantage. He knew what armor could do, what it had always done. The Americans were massing for another breakthrough attempt. Intelligence had confirmed it. Let them come. The terrain favored defense. His panzers were hull down, their hulls protected by earthworks with only the turrets exposed, camouflaged with cut branches and netting that made them nearly invisible from ground level. Supporting them were 88mm flak guns repositioned for anti-tank work, weapons that could kill any Sherman or Churchill at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers. The American tanks were numerous, yes, but they were also predictable. They would come in waves, relying on numbers rather than finesse, and German gunnery would exact a terrible toll. This was the way armored warfare worked. This was the doctrine. Tank against tank, crew against crew, where training and equipment quality mattered more than raw numbers. The Americans had tried before, at Villers-Bocage, where Michael Wittmann had single-handedly destroyed an entire British column. At Caen, where concentrated Panzer counterattacks had held against overwhelming odds. Each time, German armor had proven its worth. Air attacks, of course, were a concern. The Allies owned the skies. That much was undeniable. The Luftwaffe was a broken force, its fighters grounded by fuel shortages, and its pilots outmatched by American and British aviators who seemed to multiply like locusts. Von Luck had weathered airstrikes before. They were terrifying in their intensity, yes. The earth shook. The noise was deafening. Men's nerves frayed under the psychological pressure of being unable to fight back. But air attacks were also temporary. Bombers came, dropped their loads with varying degrees of accuracy, and departed. Fighter bombers strafed and rocketed, causing casualties and damage, but rarely achieving decisive results against hardened targets. A tank with its hatches buttoned, its crew protected by thick armor, could survive, could wait out the storm, could emerge and fight. This was the understanding, the tactical reality that every German panzer commander carried into battle. Air power was a supporting element, a tool of harassment and interdiction. Dangerous, certainly. Deadly to supply columns and infantry formations caught in the open. But not decisive. Never decisive. Not against armor properly employed. The real battle would be won or lost on the ground, as it always had been, where German tactical superiority and equipment quality could offset the Allied advantages in numbers and logistics. Then came July 25, 1944, at 11 a.m., and the world changed. Operation Cobra began not with a ground assault, but with an aerial apocalypse. First came the heavy bombers, waves of B-17s and B-24s, unleashing a carpet of high explosives that turned the earth itself into an enemy. Von Luck and his men buttoned up their tanks, sealed themselves in steel cocoons, and endured. The ground heaved. The tank rocked on its suspension like a ship in a storm. But they survived. The armor held. This was survivable. This was something they understood. The bombers eventually passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed into something resembling the surface of the moon. Craters overlapping craters, hedgerows obliterated, roads erased. Von Luck began to emerge from his turret, preparing to assess damage and reorganize his positions. That was when he heard it. A different sound cutting through the ringing in his ears and the settling dust. Not the high-altitude drone of strategic bombers at 20,000 feet, but something lower, angrier, more immediate, a roar that seemed to rise from every direction at once, building in intensity until it became almost physical, a pressure against the eardrums. Through the smoke and dust, they appeared. P-47 Thunderbolts, not a handful strafing and departing, but dozens of them, wave after wave, screaming down from 8,000 feet in near-vertical dives that defied everything Von Luck thought he knew about fighter-bomber tactics. What happened next would haunt him for the rest of his life. The P-47s didn't attack and leave. They circled. They hunted. They attacked with a methodical fury that spoke of new doctrine, new training, new purpose. They came in from different angles, making anti-aircraft fire nearly impossible to coordinate. Some carried rockets, 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets that left trails of white smoke as they screamed toward their targets. Others carried bombs, 500-pound weapons with delay fuses that allowed the aircraft to escape before detonation. And all of them carried guns. 8 50-caliber machine guns per aircraft, fired in concentrated bursts that might not penetrate armor, but found every weakness, every vulnerability. Vision slits shattered under the hammer of heavy bullets. Open hatches became death traps. Crew members caught partially exposed were torn apart. Engine decks, the thin top armor that no designer had ever thought needed heavy protection, became the killing zone as rockets punched through and detonated fuel tanks in fireballs that could be seen for miles. Von Luck watched a Panther, to his left, take a direct rocket hit to the engine compartment. The tank didn't brew up slowly. It exploded. Turret, lifting off the hull ring in a gout of flame and black smoke. Another Panther, attempting to relocate to better cover, was caught in the open by 3 P-47s working in coordinated attack. The first marked it with machine gun fire. The second dropped a 500-pound bomb that landed close enough to throw the 45-ton vehicle sideways, track shattering, suspension collapsing. The third finished it with rockets that turned the immobilized tank into a funeral pyre. A Tiger. A Tiger. The most feared tank in the world, immune to every Allied tank gun at normal combat ranges, took bomb hits that didn't even need to penetrate. The concussive force alone was enough. Optics shattered. Gun mantlet jammed. The crew, battered and bleeding from internal injuries caused by the shock waves, abandoned their invincible fortress and fled on foot. 20 minutes. That was all it took. 20 minutes of systematic, professional, devastating attack, and von Luck's company had lost 4 Panthers. Not to enemy tanks that they might have fought and killed in turn. Not to anti-tank guns that could at least be suppressed with high explosive shells. To aircraft. To an enemy that came from a direction armor, had never been designed to face, using tactics that turned every advantage of the Panzer into a liability. 6 months earlier, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt existed in a state of identity crisis. Nicknamed the Jug by pilots who flew it, some affectionately, others less so. For its bulky, almost corpulent profile, the aircraft was never supposed to be a tank killer. It was designed as a high-altitude escort fighter, built around the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine that produced over 2,000 horsepower and could push the 7-ton aircraft to altitudes where the air was so thin that pilots breathed through oxygen masks and watched their breath crystallize on instrument panels. Its mission was straightforward: protect the heavy bombers flying deep into Germany, engage Luftwaffe interceptors at 30,000 feet, and trade punches with Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s in the frozen stratosphere, where dogfighting was as much about managing engine performance as tactical maneuvering. The P-47 excelled at this role, but it was never elegant. It didn't have the sleek lines of the P-51 Mustang or the mythical grace of the Spitfire. It was blunt, heavy, honest, an aerial sledgehammer, where others were rapiers. But within that ungainly airframe lay potential that even its designers at Republic Aviation hadn't fully grasped. 8 AN/M2 Browning 50 caliber machine guns mounted in the wings, 4 per side, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. A payload capacity that could accommodate 2,500 pounds of external ordnance, bombs, rockets, drop tanks, hung from hardpoints originally intended for long-range fuel. And most crucially, a structural strength born from that very bulk that critics mocked. The P-47 could absorb punishment that would tear lighter fighters apart. It could dive from altitude like a brick wrapped in armor plate, building speed that made it nearly impossible to intercept, then pull out of that dive with enough force to make pilots see stars and engineers question the laws of physics. It was tough. It was powerful. It was looking for a new purpose. American pilots and ground commanders saw what the design bureaus had missed. By spring of 1944, with the invasion of France looming and the need for close air support becoming paramount in tactical planning, experiments began. Could the P-47 kill tanks? Initial results were decidedly mixed. Armor was simply too thick for machine gun fire alone. 50 caliber rounds that could shred aircraft aluminum and kill exposed infantry bounced off sloped tank armor like hail off a tin roof. Direct top-down attacks were suicidal. German light flak was dense and deadly, and a P-47 flying slowly in a shallow dive was a gift to any gunner with a quad 20mm cannon. But where others saw limitations, innovators saw opportunities for evolution. Enter the HVAR, the high-velocity aircraft rocket. 5 inches in diameter, 6 feet long, carrying a warhead that could punch through 3 inches of steel armor. These weren't the crude, inaccurate rockets that had plagued early ground attack aircraft. These were weapons born from naval aviation research, adapted for air-to-ground work, capable of being fired in ripple salvos that turned a single P-47 into a mobile artillery battery. Then came the bombs, not just any bombs, but 500-pound general-purpose weapons fitted with delay fuses that allowed aircraft to drop from low altitude without being destroyed by their own ordnance. And napalm, that terrible innovation, jellied gasoline that clung and burned and turned enclosed spaces into crematoriums. The weapons were ready. The platform was ready. What was needed was doctrine, tactics, the accumulated wisdom of trial and error distilled into procedures that could be taught, learned, and executed under the stress of combat. The 9th Air Force became the laboratory. Major General Elwood Pete Quesada, commanding 9 Fighter Command, was an innovator by necessity and visionary by temperament. He understood something that traditionalists in both the Army Air Forces and the ground commands often missed. Air power was not an auxiliary to ground forces. It was an equal partner, a separate dimension of warfare that could achieve effects impossible through artillery or maneuver alone. But to make it work required integration, communication, coordination at a level that neither service had attempted before. Quesada pioneered the cab rank system, fighter bombers orbiting on station like taxis waiting for fares, ready to be called down by forward air controllers, embedded with frontline units, who could identify targets and direct strikes in near real time. He established communication protocols using radios that let ground commanders talk directly to pilots, bypassing the traditional chain of command that added hours or days to target identification and engagement. He borrowed dive bombing techniques from Navy pilots who had been perfecting the art of precision attack against moving ships, adapting their methods for use against moving armor. Most importantly, he developed team tactics where flights of P-47s worked in coordinated groups, one marking targets with smoke rockets or machine gun fire, another delivering the killing blow with bombs or heavy rockets, a third providing top cover against any Luftwaffe fighters, brave or foolish enough to interfere. By June of 1944, the pieces were in place. The P-47 had found its calling. On the other side of the tactical equation, German Panzer commanders began to feel the pressure mounting like water behind a weakening dam. July 26th and 27th, 1944, as Operation Cobra accelerated, and the American breakout from the Normandy beachhead gathered unstoppable momentum. The pattern that had started on the 25th intensified into a nightmare of repetition. German armor tried to move. German armor died. The Panzers attempted to adapt, using the same tactical flexibility that had served them so well on other fronts. They moved only at night, navigation by moonlight and dead reckoning, hoping darkness would shield them from the Jabos, the German slang for Jagdbombers, fighter bombers, that had become synonymous with aerial terror. They dispersed during daylight hours, breaking companies into platoons, platoons into individual vehicles, hiding in tree lines and barns and anywhere that might offer concealment from above. They deployed smoke generators, burning oil-soaked rags to create artificial fog that might obscure movement. Unit commanders issued orders forbidding any grouping larger than 3 vehicles during daylight hours. Anti-aircraft assets were redistributed. Quad 20mm flak guns positioned with every tank company. Their crews trained to watch the skies as intently as tankers watch the ground. Some measures worked, at least temporarily. Panzer Lehr Division, that elite formation considered one of Germany's finest armored units, managed a daylight movement of 30 tanks with only 2 losses. A tactical victory given the circumstances. Proof that adaptation was possible, that the old skills still mattered. But the P-47 groups were relentless and learning even faster. The 362nd, 365th, and 366th fighter groups operated from forward airfields so close to the front that pilots could see the battle lines from their cockpits during takeoff. They flew 4, 5, 6 sorties per day, a tempo of operations that ground crews supported through backbreaking labor, and pilots endured through a combination of youth, adrenaline, and the knowledge that every hour they spent in the air was an hour closer to going home. Each pilot became a tank hunter, developing an almost supernatural ability to spot the telltale signs of armor below. Dust trails that moved wrong, too straight and purposeful to be livestock or civilians. The geometric shapes that didn't belong in farmland. Straight lines and right angles in a landscape of curves and organic growth. The glint of metal that vegetation couldn't quite hide. They learned to read the battlefield like a text, identifying not just tanks, but the infrastructure that supported them. Fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, command vehicles whose destruction could paralyze entire formations. SS Sturmbannführer Otto Carius, the Tiger Ace with over 150 confirmed kills, whose name was spoken with reverence in German armored circles, found himself writing diary entries that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. His words carried the bitterness of a master craftsman watching his profession become obsolete. "We can defeat any Allied tank in a fair fight. Our guns are superior. Our optics are superior. Our crews are better trained. But there are no fair fights anymore. The Jabos make every movement, every redeployment, a death sentence waiting to be carried out. We have lost more Tigers to air attack in 2 weeks than we lost to enemy tanks in 6 months of fighting on the Eastern Front." It was a confession of helplessness from a man who had built his reputation on tactical excellence, an admission that individual skill no longer mattered when the enemy owned the vertical dimension. By late July 1944, the German Panzer divisions had not yet broken, not entirely, not yet. These were formations commanded by men who had survived the cauldrons of the Eastern Front, who had learned their craft in the brutal schools of Barbarossa and Kursk, where adaptation meant survival and rigidity meant death. They were not going to surrender to despair without fighting back with every weapon in their doctrinal arsenal. Veteran commanders began developing countermeasures born from the same tactical flexibility that had made German armor so formidable in the first place. Anti-aircraft support was massively increased. Quad 20mm flak guns, originally designed to protect static positions and airfields, were repositioned with every tank company, their crews integrated into the Panzer formations, with orders to watch the skies with the same intensity that tankers watched their frontal arcs. These were fearsome weapons when properly employed. Rapid-fire autocannons that could throw up curtains of explosive shells, capable of shredding an aircraft's control surfaces and hydraulics. Orders came down from division level forbidding movement in groups larger than 3 vehicles during daylight hours. The massive armored columns that had characterized blitzkrieg warfare, those intimidating parades of steel that had terrorized Europe, were broken down into dispersed elements that moved independently, navigating by map and compass to predetermined rally points. Tank commanders were instructed to use every scrap of available cover, tree lines, buildings, even the ruins of buildings destroyed by previous bombardments. Some units employed an innovation born of desperation: decoy tanks. Knocked out hulls from previous engagements, Panthers and Tigers already dead, were positioned in exposed locations to draw P-47 attacks away from operational armor. The Americans would dive on what appeared to be a target-rich environment, expend their ordnance on vehicles already destroyed, and depart satisfied with their kill claims while the real Panzers remained hidden and intact. The deception worked often enough to be worth the effort. Panzer Lehr Division, that elite formation commanded by General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, Rommel's former chief of staff in Africa, a man who understood mobile warfare at the highest levels, managed a remarkable achievement on July 29th. 30 operational tanks moved 15 kilometers in daylight, with only 2 losses to air attack. It was a tactical victory that seemed to suggest the worst was over, that German expertise could still find answers, that the old playbook might still work if executed with sufficient skill and discipline. The Americans were paying their own terrible price for the new doctrine they had created. P-47 pilots, who had trained to fight at high altitude, who had expected to spend their combat tours engaging enemy fighters in the thin air above 20,000 feet, where combat was almost abstract, a matter of deflection shooting and energy management, now found themselves flying low and slow during attack runs that made them horrifyingly vulnerable. German light flak was not just deadly, it was ubiquitous. Every crossroads seemed to have a quad 20mm position. Every tank column traveled with self-propelled anti-aircraft guns, whose crews had learned to wait until the P-47s were committed to their attack runs. Engines throttled back, aircraft hanging in the air for those few critical seconds when evasion was impossible. On July 28th, the 362nd Fighter Group lost 6 aircraft in a single afternoon. 6 pilots who had survived the odds over Germany, who had shot down Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs in fair fights at altitude, were blown out of the sky by flak while attacking ground targets they could barely identify through smoke and dust. First Lieutenant Robert Johnson, already an ace with 27 aerial victories, became a legend for surviving what should have been unsurvivable. His P-47 absorbed over 70 hits from a Focke-Wulf 190 that caught him during recovery from an attack run. 20mm cannon shells that punched holes through wings and fuselage, shattered the canopy, destroyed instruments, and yet somehow missed every critical system. He nursed the crippled aircraft back to England, landing gear up in a controlled crash that he walked away from, living proof of the P-47's legendary toughness. But his survival was the exception that highlighted the rule. Dive-bombing tanks was not the precision work of high-altitude escort missions. It was close-range violence where one mistake, one moment of target fixation, 1 second too long in the attack run meant being caught by flak that would tear an aircraft apart. The pilots kept flying because that was the mission, because ground commanders told them that every tank destroyed meant fewer American infantrymen killed, because the statistics, however imprecise, suggested they were winning. But they understood the cost in a way that staff officers reading after-action reports could not. They were trading altitude for targets, safety for effectiveness, and the exchange rate was written in blood. By July 30th, something strange and dangerous began to emerge from the chaos, a false sense of equilibrium. The Germans had learned when they could move safely. Dawn and dusk, those liminal hours when light was poor and P-47s were transitioning between bases and patrol stations, offered windows of opportunity. Overcast conditions, even thin cloud cover, dramatically reduced the effectiveness of air attacks. At night, German armor could still move with relative impunity, and veteran units became expert at covering ground in darkness, then going to ground before first light. The Americans, for their part, had learned which targets mattered most. Individual tanks were valuable kills, but destroying fuel trucks meant entire formations became immobilized. Knocking out command vehicles disrupted coordination. Cratering roads at key choke points created bottlenecks where follow-up attacks could achieve devastating results. Tank kill claims were impressive. The 9th Air Force reported over 300 Panzers destroyed in the first 5 days of Operation Cobra, but the numbers were imprecise at best, wildly inflated at worst. In the confusion of combat, with smoke obscuring the battlefield and multiple aircraft attacking the same targets, verification was nearly impossible. A knocked-out vehicle might be claimed by 3 different pilots. Self-propelled guns were reported as tanks. Half-tracks and armored cars became Panthers in the heat of the moment. Even trucks, when seen through gun sights at 400 knots, could be mistaken for armored vehicles. The actual number of tanks destroyed was certainly lower than claimed, but the psychological impact was exponentially higher than the statistics suggested. A dangerous mythology began to take hold on the German side. Commanders who had weathered the initial storm began to believe they had found the formula for survival. If they could just hold the line until autumn weather grounded the Allied air forces, until reinforcements arrived from Germany, until the Americans overextended their supply lines and stalled. The old rules might reassert themselves. Armor properly employed could still turn the tide of battle. The fundamentals of tank warfare had not changed, they told themselves. They had simply been temporarily obscured by overwhelming Allied air superiority. Once that advantage was neutralized by weather or distance, or the inevitable friction of extended operations, German tactical excellence would prevail. It was a comforting lie built on selective interpretation of evidence. Yes, Panzer Lehr had moved 30 tanks successfully. But what they chose not to emphasize was that those 30 tanks represented less than a third of the division's authorized strength, that the movement had required days of preparation and favorable conditions, that 2 losses out of 30 was actually a catastrophic attrition rate if sustained over weeks of operations. The old playbook was not working. It was failing in slow motion, and the veterans who had survived by trusting their instincts were now trusting doctrine that had been rendered obsolete by technological and tactical evolution they refused to fully acknowledge. Then came the weather forecast for early August. Perfect conditions, clear skies, unlimited visibility, light winds, no rain predicted for at least a week. The Americans had broken through the German lines at Avranches, that crucial gap in the defensive cordon through which entire armies could pour into the interior of France. German armor was being rushed forward to plug the breach, to contain the breakout before it became a rout, to execute the kind of armored counterattack that had saved desperate situations before. And in the sky above Normandy, 400 P-47 Thunderbolts were being armed, fueled, and briefed for the largest concentrated tank hunting operation of the war. The equilibrium was about to shatter. The Falaise pocket was not supposed to exist. In the pristine logic of staff maps and operational planning, the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army should have executed an orderly withdrawal eastward toward the Seine, trading space for time, preserving combat strength for the defense of the Reich itself. But war rarely obeys the pristine logic of staff officers, and by August 7, 1944, 30,000 German troops found themselves caught in a shrinking corridor between American forces driving east from Avranches and British, and Canadian forces pushing south from Caen. The pocket measured roughly 15 miles east to west, 10 miles north to south, a trap defined not by walls of concrete and barbed wire, but by converging Allied armies, and more crucially, by clear skies that stretched from horizon to horizon with no relief in sight. Every road that might offer escape, every field that could conceal movement, every tree line that promised shelter was visible from above. And the weather held. Day after day, the sun rose into cloudless skies, and with the sun came the P-47s. What unfolded over the next 2 weeks was not combat in any conventional sense. It was systematic destruction, the methodical dismantling of fighting formations that had once been the terror of Europe, reduced now to prey animals trying desperately to find cover from predators that ruled the sky. This was execution. The P-47 groups worked in relays with an efficiency that would have impressed factory managers. One group would attack, while another rearmed and refueled at forward airstrips so close to the front lines that ground crews could hear the artillery. The moment one flight exhausted its ordnance and turned for home, another was already overhead, rolling into attack runs with the practiced precision of assembly line workers. They targeted the roads first, understanding that mobility was everything. A 500-pound bomb cratering a narrow country lane didn't just destroy the road surface. It created an impassable obstacle that forced entire columns to halt, to bunch up, to become concentrated targets for the flights that followed. Burning vehicles became roadblocks that turned retreat routes into killing grounds. German drivers learned to dread the sound of aircraft engines overhead because they knew what came next. Either they abandoned their vehicles and fled into the ditches, hoping the strafing runs would miss them, or they stayed with their trucks and tanks and died when rockets found them. The 5-inch HVAR proved devastatingly effective against armor when striking from above. Tank designers had spent years perfecting frontal armor, sloping glacis plates to deflect anti-tank rounds, thickening turret faces to withstand direct hits from enemy guns. But top armor had always been an afterthought. Thin steel meant only to keep out rain and shrapnel, never imagined to face direct attack. A rocket striking the engine deck of a Panther didn't just disable the vehicle. It detonated fuel tanks, ignited ammunition, created fireballs that could be seen for miles, and served as beacons drawing more aircraft to the carnage. Major Georg Baumgartner commanded a company of Panthers from the 116th Panzer Division, and he witnessed the systematic disintegration of everything German armored doctrine had promised. His unit entered the Falaise pocket with 18 operational tanks on August 8th. They were good tanks crewed by veterans, men who had survived the Eastern Front, who knew their business, who could service a transmission under fire and execute a tactical withdrawal while engaging superior numbers. None of it mattered. His Panthers never fired a shot at enemy armor. They never had the chance. One by one, the P-47s found them. A Panther, hiding in a barn, was destroyed when rockets collapsed the structure, and subsequent passes set the wreckage ablaze. 3 tanks attempting to move during what they thought was a lull in air activity were caught in open farmland by a flight that seemed to materialize from nowhere, rockets and bombs reducing them to burning hulls in less than 2 minutes. 2 more were abandoned by their crews who simply could not endure another day of sitting in steel coffins waiting for death from above. By August 15th, Baumgartner had 3 tanks remaining. His crews were beyond exhaustion, shell-shocked not from artillery, but from the constant screaming of aircraft engines, the whistle of falling bombs, the whoosh of rockets that gave perhaps half a second of warning before impact. Men who had been steady under Soviet bombardments, who had held their positions while T-34s charged their lines, now refused to mount the tanks during daylight. Some abandoned their vehicles and fled on foot, choosing to take their chances as infantrymen, rather than remain in what had become death traps. Baumgartner watched the courage drain from his men, not through cowardice, but through the simple mathematics of helplessness. They could not fight back. They could only wait to die. The numbers told a story that statistics alone could never fully capture. Allied air forces flew over 12,000 sorties during the Falaise battle. 12,000 separate missions, each one involving multiple aircraft, crews, ordnance loads, coordination between ground controllers and flight leaders. The 9th Air Force P-47s alone claimed over 500 armored vehicles, destroyed, tanks, self-propelled guns, half-tracks, armored cars. The entire mechanized ecosystem of modern warfare burned and broken across the Norman countryside. When Allied forces finally closed the pocket on August 21st and infantry units moved through the wreckage to count and catalog, they found a graveyard of German armor stretching for miles. The commander of the 2nd French Armored Division, a man who had fought in World War I and seen the worst industrial slaughter could offer, walked through the devastation and described it as the most concentrated killing ground I have ever witnessed. Vehicles were piled upon vehicles, some destroyed while attempting to push past earlier wrecks, others caught in traffic jams that became mass graves when the P-47s returned for another pass. The destruction was so complete, so overwhelming, that Allied intelligence officers initially suspected the claims were exaggerated. Surely no air attack, no matter how intensive, could achieve such results. But the evidence was there in twisted steel and charred metal, in Panthers with their turrets blown 20 meters from their hulls, in Tigers abandoned intact by crews who simply walked away rather than die inside them. Beyond the raw statistics of destruction lay something more profound and more damaging than any material loss: the psychological collapse of the Panzer Arm. German tank commanders who had fought for 5 years, who wore Knight's Crosses earned in desperate battles from France to the Caucasus, who had stopped British armor at Arras and broken Soviet counterattacks at Kursk, were reduced to hiding in barns during daylight hours like fugitives. The most feared weapon of mobile warfare, the instrument that had conquered half of Europe, had become a liability that drew death from the sky. Hans von Luck, who had entered Normandy with the confidence of doctrine and experience, would write decades later with the painful clarity of survivor's hindsight. In Normandy, I learned that all our training, all our tactical excellence, meant nothing when the enemy owned the sky. We were masters of tank warfare, but the war had moved beyond tanks. Otto Carius, the ace who had destroyed over 150 enemy tanks in direct combat, recorded in his diary a truth that shattered the mythology German propaganda had built around armored knights. Give me a fair fight, and I will win. But there are no fair fights anymore. The Jabos have taken fairness from war and replaced it with slaughter from above. These were not the words of defeated men finding excuses. These were professionals acknowledging that the rules had fundamentally changed. That expertise in the old warfare meant nothing in the face of the new reality. The faith that had sustained German armor through 5 years of war, belief in tactical superiority, equipment quality, and the decisive power of the Panzer died in the Norman fields alongside the tanks themselves. In the temporary prisoner of war camps that sprouted across liberated France in September 1944, German tank commanders sat in silence that spoke more eloquently than any interrogation report. These were not ordinary soldiers. They wore the insignia of Panzer regiments. Some bore the Knight's Cross at their throats, that highest decoration for battlefield valor that marked them as the elite of the elite. They were men who had commanded battalions, who had led breakthrough operations in Poland and France, who had held impossible positions on the Eastern Front against Soviet masses that should have overwhelmed them through sheer weight of numbers. They had expected, if defeat came, that it would arrive in a form they understood. Superior numbers grinding them down through attrition. Better logistics sustaining enemy offensives they could not match. The industrial might of nations with populations and resources that dwarfed Germany's capacity to replace losses. These were acceptable ways to lose a war. Tragic, perhaps, but comprehensible within the framework of military professionalism. What they had not expected, what their training and doctrine had never prepared them for, was to be hunted like animals from the sky, to watch their invincible panzers reduced to burning coffins by aircraft they could not engage, to experience the unique horror of tactical helplessness while possessing superior equipment and training. The myth they had served that German tactical excellence and superior weaponry could overcome material disadvantage had not merely been challenged. It had been obliterated so thoroughly that even acknowledging its destruction felt like betraying everything they had believed about their profession. So they sat in silence, processing a defeat that was also a revelation, understanding finally that they had been fighting the last war, while the enemy had already moved on to the next one. For the American P-47 pilots, the revelation carried a different emotional weight, but equal historical significance. They had proven something that military theorists would debate for decades, but that they understood viscerally in August 1944. Fighters were not merely for air-to-air combat. The escort mission, protecting bombers, engaging enemy fighters, controlling the airspace was important, even vital. But the P-47 pilots had created something new, a doctrine of close air support that integrated aerial firepower directly into ground operations with a precision and devastating effectiveness that previous generations of military aviators had only dreamed about. The Jug, that nickname born from its ungainly appearance, became legendary not for the mission it was designed to accomplish, but for the mission it learned to execute through innovation and blood. By war's end, P-47 Thunderbolts flying in the European theater would be credited with destroying over 6,000 armored vehicles. The number was imprecise, wartime accounting always is, but even if reduced by half to account for overclaiming and misidentification, The impact was undeniable. They had fundamentally altered the calculus of armored warfare. Every tank commander, German or otherwise, would now have to factor in the threat from above as equal to or greater than the threat from ground-based anti-tank weapons. The sky was no longer neutral territory. It was a battlefield dimension that could decide the outcome of ground combat, regardless of what happened in the dirt. The Germans tried to adapt, but adaptation required resources and time that the Reich no longer possessed. By December 1944, when Hitler launched his desperate gamble in the Ardennes, the offensive that history would remember as the Battle of the Bulge, German Panzer commanders were planning operations around weather forecasts with the intensity of farmers praying for rain. The offensive was deliberately timed to exploit the worst winter weather in decades. Fog, snow, low clouds, these became weapons more valuable than any Tiger or Panther. When the attack launched on December 16th through the forests of Belgium, German armor initially achieved stunning success, precisely because Allied aircraft were grounded. The P-47 sat on their forward airstrips, pilots staring at skies too thick with cloud to permit operations, while below them, German panzers punched through American lines in scenes that recalled the Blitzkrieg victories of 1940. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed the old rules might still apply. But weather, unlike doctrine, cannot be commanded. On December 23rd, the clouds broke, the sky cleared, and the P-47s returned with a vengeance born from days of enforced inactivity. The pattern repeated with the inevitability of Greek tragedy. German armor caught in the open, attempting to exploit breakthrough opportunities, was systematically destroyed from above. Fuel trucks were priority targets, and without fuel, the most powerful tanks became immobile pillboxes. Supply columns that should have sustained the offensive were burned on the roads. The Bulge collapsed not because American ground forces defeated German panzers in tank-on-tank combat, though such battles occurred and were fierce, but because Allied air power strangled the offensive's logistics and mobility. Once again, German armor learned that tactical excellence meant nothing when the enemy owned the sky. Once again, commanders who had survived Normandy felt the sick familiarity of helplessness returning. What happened in Normandy, and repeated in the Ardennes, was not merely about tanks and planes. It was about the eternal tension between tradition and innovation, between doctrine refined through experience and doctrine that must evolve to meet new realities. The Germans had built their entire military strategy around the primacy of ground combat, particularly armored mobile warfare. Their doctrine was sophisticated, their training rigorous, their equipment in many ways superior to Allied equivalents. But doctrine, however refined, becomes dogma when it cannot adapt to fundamental changes in the character of warfare. The Germans saw air power as a supporting element, dangerous but ultimately subordinate to the decisive ground battle. They were not stupid or blind. They understood that Allied air superiority complicated their operations. But they never fully internalized that the sky had become the dominant dimension, that control of the air could determine outcomes on the ground regardless of tactical brilliance or equipment superiority. The Americans, less bound by doctrinal tradition because their military had been built largely from scratch for this war, saw an opportunity and seized it with both hands. They transformed an escort fighter into a tank killer, not because some manual said it was possible, but because the mission demanded it, and the aircraft proved capable when given the chance. Innovation born from necessity, executed with the kind of pragmatic flexibility that comes from not being weighed down by decades of accumulated doctrine. The legacy of the P-47 in its ground attack role echoes through every conflict that followed. In Korea, fighter bombers provided close air support that saved United Nations forces from being pushed into the sea during the desperate fighting around the Pusan perimeter. In Vietnam, the A-1 Sky Raider, a propeller-driven attack aircraft that seemed anachronistic in the jet age, proved devastatingly effective at the same low-altitude tank-killing mission the P-47 had pioneered. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, that ungainly jet designed specifically for close air support and anti-armor operations, carried the P-47's nickname Thunderbolt as explicit homage to its spiritual ancestor. Modern attack helicopters, drones capable of loitering over battlefields for hours before striking with precision-guided munitions. The entire ecosystem of contemporary close air support, all of it traces its lineage back to those summer days over Normandy, when pilots in 7-ton fighters learned to hunt tanks, and in doing so rewrote the fundamental rules of ground warfare. The P-47 proved that air power was not merely about controlling airspace or bombing strategic targets. It could be a precision instrument that affected tactical outcomes on the battlefield directly, immediately, decisively. The veterans who survived carried understanding that transcended national boundaries. Hans von Luck, in his post-war memoir, written with the honesty that distance and age permit, paid respect to his enemies, even while describing his defeat. The P-47 pilots were brave men doing a terrible job with devastating effectiveness. They had no reason to love us, and every reason to kill us. They did their duty well. An American P-47 pilot, interviewed decades after the war, when the passions had cooled and perspective had arrived, reflected with the moral complexity that combat veterans understand. We didn't enjoy it. Destroying tanks meant killing the men inside them. And killing is not something decent people enjoy. But we ended the war faster. Every Panzer we destroyed from the air meant fewer American infantrymen died, trying to destroy it from the ground. That's how we justified it then. That's how I justify it now.